Welcome to the second build in part 1 of the Insane Nightmare Survival Guide, the Assassin. If you haven't seen the first build, the Brute, I would recommend starting there. It has a lot of useful information for surviving Insane Nightmare, and it gives you a little bit of context on the series. But if you're still here, let's get on to build 2 of 3. The Assassin is an agility build with a strong focus on stealth and mobility. This build is not going to be as simple and straightforward as the Brute build. Things that are really going to help you here are good knowledge of POIs and the game's stealth mechanics. If you're someone who regularly says something along the lines of stealth in Alpha 20 is broken, this build may not be for you, because it is in fact entirely functional. So let's get started with the playstyle of the Assassin. Just like the Brute build, you're going to want to rush out your tutorial for the 4 starting skill points, and spend the first day doing tier 1 fetch jobs, and then if you have time, any clears that you feel comfortable taking on. You'll want to do quests to get yourself up to the next tier, and to get yourself a free bicycle. For this build, unlike the Brute, there isn't any real rush for the forge or the wrench. You should be able to make a decent hunting knife with the forged iron you buy or find lying around. You don't need to craft any ranged weapons for a while. This build starts off with a real weakness in terms of base building. You won't have the strength bonuses of the Brute, so you may want to consider just right off the bat getting a really cheap horde base built up as soon as possible, so you can spend the rest of the week questing. And in your second week, build something stronger. Rewards you'll want to get yourself up to as quickly as possible are a wooden bow or an iron crossbow. These are very common tier 2 quest rewards. Another good choice is a 9mm pistol, which is a very common tier 2 and tier 3 quest reward. At the end of the first week, you should be able to have a good bow, a decent pistol, and a decent knife. You'll also want to get yourself padded armor as soon as possible, just like the Brute build. Later on in the game, you're going to want to get yourself a good compound crossbow, a good SMG, and a machete, along with military armor. Getting a ghillie suit will also be really helpful for this build. So when you're actually out there are a few things to keep in mind. Number 1 is to use stealth even if it seems slightly pointless. It will help you keep zombies from swarming you, as instead of walking into a room and all the zombies attacking you at once, you may be able to pick off a few with your bow, which leads me into number 2, which is to use your bow. You don't need any archery perks or hidden strike perks to get one-hit stealth kills on basic zombies on insane difficulty. Iron arrows and a mid-tier primitive bow should cut it early on, but rushing to a wooden bow or an iron crossbow is a really good idea because they'll one-shot a lot more reliably. Number 3 is that the knife is a lot stronger than people give it credit for. The Deep Cuts perk allows you to play with 2 effects which are massively underrated: Bleed and Slow. Knives with ranks of Deep Cuts will actually inflict a slowing effect on zombies, which is really helpful on nightmare speed. Could mean the difference between getting swarmed and getting away. Bleed stacks are also really helpful. Each rank of Deep Cuts will allow you to inflict more maximum bleed stacks and make your power attacks inflict more bleed stacks per hit. As a general rule, 2 power attacks with any kind of knife will inflict the maximum amount of bleed on a zombie. This combined with the knife's insane sneak attack damage multiplier can mean that sneaking up, stabbing a zombie with a power attack for that damage, applying a slow and applying lots of bleed, and then getting another stab in while they stand up to inflict the second half of the bleed stacks, and then using your superior mobility to get away is a really stamina efficient way to kill zombies early on. Each bleed stack you inflict extends the time that they'll bleed for, meaning the higher your deep cuts, the less stamina you'll need to use to finish them off. Stab them, get out of the way, let them die on their own. Next to no danger, hardly any stamina used, but it can be a bit of a weight, but it's also very resource efficient, as you're able to damage zombies without having to be necessarily right next to them, and you won't have to waste any ammo. You'll know a zombie is bleeding by the blood spurts and the damage sound effects. If they stop grunting, the bleed has worn off and you'll need to go in for a few more attacks. There is a bug that causes some zombies that die of bleed to not give XP, but honestly it's not common enough to matter in the long run. Most of your XP will come from the actual quest XP. Fourth tip is to use stones. Stones and snowballs can be used to distract zombies, but not animals. This can be used outside at night to distract any ferals you aren't ready to one-hit kill yet. And the fifth tip is that a zombie waking up in a POI and making all the grunty sounds doesn't necessarily mean that you've been fully detected. If you hear a zombie wake up and want to try and prevent the situation from escalating, try staying stealth and go back through the POI a little bit. The zombie will go to where they last heard you, and you can use that to get another attack in away from the rest of the pack. You'll want to do a lot of questing with this build, even though it doesn't use Daring Adventurer. Questing is still the most efficient way this build is going to get XP. I would still say to avoid tier 5 POIs because they're not worthwhile on Insane Nightmare. And try and hold off on getting the tier 5 complete until you do have Daring Adventurer, unless you're 100% sure you don't want that perk. This build is not as reliant on technological advancement as some other builds. Getting a compound bow or crossbow is extremely easy and will get you most of your POI kills. The bone knife and the hunting knife scale really well into the mid game because of the bleed damage, so the machete isn't a super high priority for this build as well, which is why this build just doesn't rely on intellect as much as the other builds. By the way, the crossbow is more or less your best option when it comes to archery weapons here. You want that higher base damage and the ability to use a scope. Your reload speed shouldn't really come into play because you can take stealth at your own pace. And if things go messy, it would probably be more effective to just switch to your gun or knife. On Horde Nights, you'll want to spam pipe bombs just like the Brute build. It's not even worth it to try and use your knife and bow. Later on in the game though, you can use the crossbow with exploding bolts, and it'll be even more effective than your pipe bombs, because the explosive damage of your exploding bolts scales with archery and agility. The crossbow is likely the better option here as well, as the explosive crossbow bolts do more damage and the reload speed is relatively irrelevant because you want the zombies to pile up. One last thing to keep in mind is that you're only going to have about 60% damage resistance at your absolute best with this build. So you can't go out there and box the ferals or the heavy zombies because you'll just get folded really quickly. So use your parkour and get range on your enemies. For armor mods, you'll want custom fittings to maximize your speed on your military armor. You'll also want advanced mufflers, which will make military armor barely louder than padded armor, so go ahead and just use the military stuff. The ghillie suit and the military stealth boots will help you a lot there as well, as both have significant noise reduction boosts, and the ghillie suit's visibility reduction is really strong. Be sure to keep an eye out for the Night Stalker books for damage boosts to your main weapons at night, Urban Combat, which makes stealth a lot easier, Ranger and Pistol Pete, which are great for your bows and pistols, and the Art of Mining is of course really good all around. So the start for this build is 2 agility and 2 deep cuts. This is going to give you a solid bleed and slow bonus early on to make your starting knife a lot more reliable. You could also go for 2 ranks of parkour if you prefer a more passive playstyle, or you could even go for 2 ranks of hidden strike, and you could start one-shotting basic zombies much sooner. This build is much more reliable for doing clear jobs early on, even if you're on Feral Sense, where stealth is going to be a lot harder right off the bat. From there, you're just leveling agility, deep cuts and gunslinger all the way to 8. Parkour 4 will allow you to jump a solid 3 blocks, which will really save you a lot in this build. Gunslinger is to help you out on the first Horde night, so you can use your 9mm pistol when you run out of explosives, because your knife and bow, as I said, are going to be pretty much useless there. You want to grab Demolitions Expert 1 to guarantee pipe bombs and Master Chef 1 to guarantee coffee and meat, for the reasons I said in the last video. You may also want to grab Advanced Engineering 1 so that you can mass craft iron arrows. Anyway, moving into the mid game, you're going to dump a few points into strength and get a cigar, and get yourself a few levels of Motherlode and Miner 69er. These perks are more or less necessary in single player, which is the context which I make these videos in, by the way. You can literally do whatever you want in multiplayer, all that matters is that you have a good multiplayer horde base. Just make sure you have 1 strength player who can do mining and 1 intellect player who can manage the trading and traps, and you'll be fine. Seriously, the people complaining about how they didn't like the Brute build because it doesn't fit how they play on multiplayer baffle me. The game is made so much easier with other people around, because the biggest thing holding you back in this game is easily your perk points. With more people, you have more levels, and more levels means more skills in general, which means that you and your team are going to be much more versatile than 1 person would be. Yes, the hordes and POIs will be harder on multiplayer, but the extra people massively outweigh the increase in difficulty, so keep in mind that for this video, this entire series, for pretty much every video I ever make, I'm not talking about multiplayer, because vanilla multiplayer is extremely easy, and honestly you probably shouldn't need all that much help with it as long as you have 1 decent player around. Anyway, I'd recommend moving back into agility and powering up your ability to sneak around, deal sneak attack damage, and do more damage with your crossbow on Horde Nights. Flurry of Blows is going to counteract the stamina and swing speed weakness of the machete. It'll just make sure that it's that much more worth using compared to the hunting knife or bone knife. Without Flurry of Blows, the machete can be somewhat stamina draining. Of course, you could also get a few ranks of Sexual Tyrannosaurus to counteract that even more, because you do have a little bit of strength. Finally, I'd grab some light armor perks so that you can craft the max level military stealth boots, which are a really good optimization for a stealth build and for the low priority bonuses the perk gives. Moving into the late game, it will really depend on what you specifically need. If you're level 50 and you've just had the worst RNG and you haven't gotten yourself a good electrical setup or a motorcycle, you want to grab yourself intellect. I'd actually advise that if you do do go for intellect that you should for getting elixir out of intellect later once you have everything you need from the tree, because other than a few useful things, your build really isn't going to be made that much stronger by having intellect. Otherwise, perception is great, of course. You can go into sniper rifles for that real ranged powerhouse assassin vibe. Salvage operations is good to get yourself some scrap for money and making some traps. Penetrator will really help with your steel bolts being able to do more damage to armored zombies, as well as allowing the aforementioned sniper rifle to hit multiple targets with armor piercing ammo. Demolitions expert isn't terrible here as well, and you could definitely switch over to using grenades or contact grenades, or just keep using pipe bombs for as long as you want. Infiltrator and lockpicking, as useless as the perks generally are, may be a fun role-playing choice for you as an assassin character if you like that kind of thing. Falling through traps and stepping on landmines just aren't actual problems that actual humans have in this game, but I suppose that they could be fun if that's the thing you're going for. Alternatively, going into fortitude and getting some passive defense perks so that you can take more punishment when you do get hit might be a worthwhile strategy. But if in doubt, just go more into agility, max out all the perks because most of them are pretty great. The assassin is a really enjoyable build that will really test your POI knowledge and your movement skills, and honestly, sometimes your aim. It really is a glass cannon which adds a lot of much needed tension into what is essentially a very easy game. Stay tuned next week where we go over the third and final Insane Nightmare build, one that will really test your game knowledge and push you to your limits, but if you can get used to it, the Engineer is one of the most powerful playstyles you can use in 7 Days to Die. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the Brute build, especially if this is all seeming a little bit difficult for you, as the Brute is by far the easiest Insane Nightmare playstyle available. As always, thank you to my channel members for making these videos possible, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.